Okay, what is a human? Well, that's a big question, but what we're really interested at this point in Chapter 5 is physically, physiologically. What are we talking about in terms of creatures? All living humans are related to one another. We're all the same species. We are all Homo sapiens. That is our specific nomenclature for who we are, right? We're not Neanderthals. Even people who, as we're going to see, have a tiny bit of Neanderthal DNA doesn't make them a Neanderthal. We are all Homo sapiens. What is a species? Well, that's something that biologists define as containing a certain type of genetic characteristics, a gene pool that can interbreed with one another. So it brings up a question. In fact, are Neanderthals a different species? Yes, because they have there's actually a significant genetic difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But the emergence of these two lines had not separated so far that they weren't able to interbreed and successfully create offspring. Kind of like a horse and a mule, for instance, or a horse and a donkey creates a mule, I should say. So a horse is not the same thing as a donkey. They can interbreed and they can create offspring that we call a mule. But unlike mules, who are all sterile, they can't have offspring. Humans and Neanderthals apparently were not so far apart from one another that they could create offspring, and that offspring then could have offspring. So there was the possibility to re-assimilate. And so we've got to, even though they were starting to branch off into different species, they came back together at a time where it was possible that they were able to emerge and merge together. There are several scenarios as to how that could have taken place. And we're going to look at some of these hypotheses for how that happened. So in addition to being able to, we're now close enough in time that we can actually get things like collagen, which allows us to analyze genetic information for some of the archaeological sites that we're talking about. You go back any further and there's no DNA left for us to analyze. But we now are recent enough periods that we can actually look at DNA of both Neanderthals and humans and determine they are separate, have separate genetic makeups. So they are different groups, even if they're not quite so different from one another. But that brings us to the point of what is a human then? If it's not a Neanderthal, we looked at what Neanderthals and where Neanderthals and when Neanderthals were in the last chapter. What were humans? Where did they come from? Who were they? What were they like? So modern human traits include a globular brain case. I talked about that last chapter. If you recall, Neanderthals have a more football-shaped, elongated brain case. We have a more vertical forehead as a consequence, so you have more of a sloping forehead with Neanderthals. Our brow ridges are also not quite so prominent as you get with Neanderthals, so we have reduced brow ridges. That globular shape also includes the sort of a lack of a prominent chin. With Neanderthals, we have a much more sticky, outy chin. And also we have a reduced body mass and we're more elongated. We have a narrower trunk than the very shorter, stockier, thick Neanderthals, which were built for the cold environment. We also have a unique pelvic shape, so when you find bits of a pelvis, you can tell a Homo sapien, modern Homo sapien apart from others. And also we have reduced tooth size, so we have smaller teeth, and as we're going to get to in the last 10,000 years, actually even smaller faces than we used to have. So that's what humans are. Those are the characteristics that we're looking for in the past, because that's who we are today. And so when I talk about humans, I mean you and me, just transport you back in time. when we're talking about humans, we're talking about people with the same kind of intellect and intellectual capability that you and I have. So we have to assume that with all of this hardware, all of this biological hardware that we're talking about in terms of human development, when it first appears, they were just as smart and capable as you and I were. But they were adapted and they were adapting and surviving in an environment that we're kind of unfamiliar with now. So they would have the ability, if you were to raise someone from 100,000 years ago in today's environment, if you were to unfreeze them and grow and have them grow up, they would probably be indistinguishable from anybody else. Likewise, if you were to, as an infant, be transported back in time and grow up in Africa with a group of early Homo sapiens there, you probably would have been indistinguishable with them as well. So these are the same people. That's what we're talking about here. And the oldest known fossils appear between about 200 and 100,000 years ago. One of the oldest known fossils is from Herto in Ethiopia that dates to about 160 to 154,000 years ago. There are no Neanderthal traits that exist. Some sort of archaizing Homo erectus traits, and so it appears as though the local Homo erectus population that never left Africa, that stayed in Africa, as we saw that Homo erectus spread all out throughout the old world, some of those Homo erectus didn't leave. So it was a population expansion. But there were some that never really left. And that indigenous population of Homo erectus appears to be the origin point from where Homo sapiens, us, where we came from. So there's also another slightly later site in South Africa, a couple of sites in South Africa that also appear to have early Homo sapiens from about 120 to 170,000 to 70,000 years ago at Classy's River mouth and Border Cave. Now, during this time we have of transition between Homo erectus into Homo sapiens. We have a very rich evidence for artifactual remains. We have tools that were left behind. So from about 300,000 to about 200,000 years ago, we see the Acheulean industry, which had been dominant for hundreds of thousands of years since some of the earliest Homo erectus appeared. This started to be replaced by the African Middle Stone Age technologies. They started to use points for hunting and of different types. So they were even used things like on the coast. They were using coral as points to hunt with. Use of fire is well documented during this period, and they also were using things like marine resources. There's a lot of shell middens. They were eating mollusks and other types of shellfish. From Pinnacle Point, South Africa, there's good evidence from about 160,000 years ago. They were also developing new tools, things like small microliths. Now you may wonder, okay, why is a tiny little thing better than a big blade or a big spearhead? Well, different tools for different purposes. We have a pretty good idea of what these microliths, and we're talking tiny, tiny, tiny little fragments of chips of stone. What they would have been done is you would have embedded them into a haft of some sort. So you would have embedded them into like a harpoon or an arrow that would have had barbs on it that went up the sides of these tiny little microliths that were embedded in there. But also you have a variety of different tool types, perhaps for different jobs, but also perhaps for different groups of these early humans that were doing things slightly differently in different environments. So in Central and East Africa, you tend to have more heavy-duty tools. In South Africa, you have these crescentic microliths. And in the North Africa, you have bifaces and points with tangs, which would have probably been for hafting in either a spear point or something like that. Also, we now have evidence, because we're getting more recent periods, some other types of materials survive, like bone. And the oldest known bone tools date from about at least as early as 75,000 years ago from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And also Blumbos Cave, which is an important site that I'll talk a little bit more about, has bone points and awls that you can you're using to drill with a little bit. That's in South Africa and dates to about 77,000 years ago, but this site could go back to as early as 100,000 years ago. Now, Blumbos Cave is very important because in addition to some of these tools that are very interesting, there's also what might possibly be called the earliest artwork. There is a incised bit of ochre that has just a simple geometric cross-hatching pattern incised into it. Now, we talked a little bit about red ochre, what that is. It's a pigment, so it's a special mineral that would have been used to make paints. But this little bit of ochre was found with etchings on it, just cross hatches in a pattern. Why is that so important? Well, we talked a little bit in the last chapter about using your brain. It's not just about imagining a better tool to survive. A crosshatch pattern represents something that has never existed before in this context, but it came out of the imagination of a human. So it's kind of just like you doodle on your page, right? But that's your imagination taking over. I want to see a pleasing pattern. I want to create something out of the world around me. Now that's setting you on a path. Artwork is really important. It's setting you down a path for imagining a new world, a world that doesn't exist, but one that you can create through the power of your brain, through the power of your imagination, and the power of your manipulation of the world around you. That's going to become very important eventually. So there's a few of these from South Africa, from Kian Klipuis and Pinnacle Point, as well as Blumbos Cave. And also we have evidence for things like pierced shells, beads, some paint on a slab. Do these represent symbolism? Are they aesthetics? Well, this is something we can talk about and debate, but what it is the imagination of humans manipulating and altering the world to create something that they invented. Now, I've said this before, but we live in a world that is invented. We live in houses, we live in air-conditioned places, we live with artificial lights. All of the stuff that makes up our modern world is the consequence of human imagination coming up with stuff, making it real in the real world. And this is the first hints of this starting to appear about 100,000 years ago and later. And it just became more and more elaborate because you don't have to invent everything for the first time every time you do it. I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time I get into a car and drive, for instance. So we build upon those ideas through tradition, through training, through our communities. And so you're starting to see that the first inklings of that imagination starting to impact the world around them, but we're going to see that this actually grows and grows and builds. So I think we'll stop there for the moment, and we're going to come back and we're going to start looking at when humans start to appear out of Africa and what they did when they encountered the Neanderthals and other groups outside. So we'll come back in just a moment.